All right, so this is our first session on this book, Early Greek Thinking by Heidegger. We went to it after the Word of Nietzsche essay, in part because of the big claim in that essay that there's something like the structure of metaphysics itself that is coterminous with something like an historical nihilism and something like nothing happening to being. And this is a place where that would sort of have to be proved out. That should have a meta framing of this. Obviously, we also just care about what's going on in this book in its own terms. Everything it lays out here. There may be some progression in the course of the book of where he is and all that. So we don't want to hold him too much to something outside of this particular text, if you get me. But that's our reading for this time. I have some questions to begin with before we get into round the first reactions. I should just explain a little bit of format for our new fellow. I typically, go around table, get first reactions to everyone on whether or not they managed to do the reading, any issues they had with it, prior familiarity with either the particular text and other things from Heidegger. For a lot of the people who've been here before, I know the answers to those questions, but for new people, you can go into that a little bit on your level of background, because we'll just help other people know what level to pitch their comments or explanations when for you. So that's first thing we tend to do on round of feedback, and then we typically try to go through the text in some detail. I'll do a little bit of expository stuff, but also invite everybody to jump in, ask questions, give me their own takes on things as we go through that. And then in this case, there's multiple parts of the readings and multiple parts within each of the essays. So there's going to go through those basically in the order they are in the reading, and then talk a little bit about what we might general reflections on what we've read so far, what we might do for next time. One of the meta questions I have, though, is because in terms of the announcement on the Meetup site, I only gave people about 2 weeks to get the book. If they already had the book, not a problem. But if they only had a little bit of time to get the book, I don't know if anyone got it in time. The other thing is there's 4 fragments in this book, and we know if the pacing is right. I set 2 of them for the first one and 2 of them for the second one, which has us doing the whole reading in 2 sessions. That seems like a fine pacing for me, but I don't know if it's too fast for some people. If it's with the level of detail of the material, either from the Greeks, the age of the metaphysics or something, I need to know if it's the right pace, basically. So if you'd rather break this into one of these things each time and do this over 4 sessions instead of 2, let me know. If everybody's okay with it, I'm planning to finish out the books, the last 2 fragments, the Parmenides fragment and the second Heraclitus fragment, in one more session, and we can talk about at the end of this talk what we might do after that. But we might go back to some of the other essays in the Question Concerning Technology book. Anyway, that's just some of the administrative stuff to get out of the way. So when you go around, if you could tell me, did you already have the book? Did you get the book in time? Did you manage to do the reading? Is the pace okay? And then also just your first reactions. Joe?
Well, I read, I think, all but the last page of the Aximander one, the first one. And I just didn't get to the Heraclitus fragment after that.
Yep.
So I'd be happy to actually start with it next time. But laying that aside, I found going through the first one extremely difficult. What was difficult about it was the fact that he kept using a number of repeated Greek presentations, referring to what he was talking about. And I didn't know what they meant. And there's no glossary, and it's very frustrating. Mm-hmm. And when you see them often enough, you might think, well, you're going to pick it up to absorption. I didn't really. And so very frustrating. But slugging through, I also came to a number of paragraphs. First, he would repeat himself. He'd say something 3 or 4 different times, slightly differently each time. And I assume there's good reason for that. The lawyers do it all the time, of course, just for precision and clarity. But I found that much of this stuff sounded very mystical, very mystical. And I began to puzzle through what is he saying? And so I found paragraph slogging through. I had to read a paragraph like that 3 or 4 times, and I'm still not satisfied that I got my meaning out of it. Mm-hmm. I got a few good things out of the Aximander reading, a couple of good interpretations, and I'll get to those as we discuss the whole thing, and I'll go through it with you. But I found it very frustrating, and so I didn't get to the conclusion. I hope that you can explicate a lot, and I can just learn through listening to the interpretation rather than try to pick it up from Heidegger's own text and his obscure Greek symbolisms.
I understand. I mean, it's also great if you can ask me like particular questions about particular things. I mean, there's the topic of what translation really means is actually one of the other things he's talking about in the essay. So he gives multiple standard translations, and then he does his own truncations on things and gives his own translations of them. And then he gives even more radical translations of things where he uses his own, as you put it, more mystical or poetical interpretations of some of the words in place of the ones that are the common ones you'll get from Giles or even from Nietzsche. And that this is an extremely conscious thing. He's engaged in the enterprise that we call radical interpretation of the text, meaning he's reading in things there, seeing if he can see things there, in his point of view, trying to translate himself into the atmosphere type of thought that he thinks these thinkers were going through. He does think that that is a poetic thing. That's part of the mystical angle you're hearing, that this is a an early and poetic metaphysics that he is trying to grasp as something essentially Greek, but that can only be reached by translating oneself, not the words, into that frame of thought and being, trying your hand at thinking that way is kind of the point of it, right? So he is definitely engaged in that. There's also some things early on where he's sort of laying out his own take on things before he's even actually talking about the fragment. So he's putting his whole enterprise of interpreting the fragment inside a frame of his own, of how he understands this in his own philosophy and his own activity. So there's definitely multi voices going on. He's reacting to previous translators. He's framing the whole thing in his own understanding. Then he's trying to understand what an Aximander might have been thinking. And as he does that, he's getting more and more daring about how far he's willing to push those translations away from the common reading or the ordinary reading of the terms. I think it's also fair to say that of the four, this is the one where he, in a sense, reaches the most. The other translations and the other segments in the book are closer to the traditional translations. That doesn't mean he doesn't see more in them than some of the traditional readings do. He tries to, but here there's a lot of that reaching. He's like, one of the things he's trying to demonstrate, in act rather than just by telling you, is that it is possible to see much more in these things than the typical doxographic approach of the late 19th century or even of the Hellenistic age saw in them, where they thought it was enough to report, this is a thinker, he wrote this line, it seems to have this opinion about this common problem, next, right? There's a sort of shallow doxographical way of understanding these things. It's just one opinion after another from different people, very shallowly understood, not really digested, meant to be understood really only in contrast with each other rather than on their own terms. And in the early part, he's sort of putting down that kind of historiography as just too shallow for this kind of thinking. But I agree with you that it's challenging. By the later portions of the essay, he's generalizing from what he just did with Anaximander to seeing this as part of a kind of, seeing this as a kind of spirit of Greek metaphysics, how Greek metaphysics was in the pre-Socratic era, right? And he winds up making all these sweeping connections of what he said here to later thinkers in that tradition, alluded to in such terse formula that you may not even know that's who he's talking about, or he'll barely mention their name along with a few key points of their doctrine. But all of that is part of trying to show that there's something like a coherent project of Greek metaphysics, something like that, across all of these different thinkers, which isn't necessarily the same as what the doxographers or historiographers see in it. or even the common interpretation that we get from places like Aristotle's metaphysics, going over each of these thinkers. Joe, question?
I presume, or do we know, did Heraclitus and or Parmenides read each other and Aximander and stuff?
So with in the case, Anaximander is before them, so they probably were aware of him. Some of them, some of the later thinkers refer to the earlier ones. In the case of Parmenides and Heraclitus, we're not even sure if they were, which one was before the other, or if they were contemporaries, or if they overlapped, or how much. Their philosophies almost seem like they're reactions to one another, but there are common understandings of the time between them to put either one first. I think the usual one is Heraclitus slightly before, but they're close to being contemporary. So you shouldn't really think of them as being in an order with one reacting to the other. People like Anaximander are definitely earlier than either Heraclitus or Parmenides. All three of them are definitely earlier than anything we have from Socrates.
But they represent a common, some kind of common point of view that we can take presented to us as the the Greek view or something.
It's more like a common way of doing metaphysics, and it's not even all that common. I mean, they're laying out the different ways of doing metaphysics. There were some people before Anaximander, people like Thales, etc., who had theories of the all that are we know relatively little about them, but we know about them. We often know from ancient reports and places like discussions of them in Aristotle's Metaphysics, where they're thought of as the physiologoi, the those who reason about nature, right? And that's sort of the common term for them, especially on Ionia, those who reason about nature. But they there's definitely a progression of them in the sense that after several more opinionated things that maybe are more narrowly focused on just nature, and Aximander is famous for the person who says the underlying of the whole is not the water or air or the four elements these other people are talking about. It's the unlimited. It's the infinite, right? That's sort of the characteristic thing you get in Aximander. And then in Heraclitus, you get fire, but really more like becoming and change. And in Parmenides, you get something like being and truth as unchanging. And then in Anaxagoras, who's like the immediate predecessor of Plato, it's mind. So there's definitely a progression away from the purely physical speculation toward these this way more philosophical themes that are less strictly physical, if you can put it that way. So that's a tendency, and all of them are engaged in one other form of this metaphysical thinking. I think it's fair to say that. But are they in one school or five? Right? There's people differ on the point. In Plato, they're presented as being, most of them are in the camp of Heraclitus and Homer, who are the partisans of change, and Parmenides and a few people are in the camp of being on the other side. But that's just Plato's own Parmenidean spin on it, or his Parmenidean strangers way of laying it out. It was one of his characters who's meant to be a partisan of the Parmenidean view. So anyway, for overviews of all that, there's plenty of intros that sort of give the basic doxography things, but I think the early part of this is fair, that kind of understanding these things tends to be shallow. It doesn't really get to the roots of it. But I'm going to go on to other reactions. I'm going on a little bit too long. Pete, you want to give us your?
Yeah, so I got through both of them. I finished the Heraclitus yesterday. I could have done with more time.
Okay.
If I'd had more time, I'd go back and reread the Anaximander. So I can see why the Anaximander's first, because it has the intro where Heidegger kind of lays out the groundwork of why he's reading this, and that he's reacting to Nietzsche and the metaphysical background. So I can see why that one's first, but yeah, it's the least convincing. He really goes, really has to stretch his etymology and let me think, what do I want to say? So I read it in the Off the Beaten Track too.
Okay, yeah, okay. It's
Which I
also
think,
collected, yeah.
it's a couple decades later. I think it's a little easier to read, more in the mainstream Heidegger in English vocabulary. And so the Heraclitus I like. So I've read these before.
Yep.
So I was rereading them, and this time in the Heraclitus, I appreciated what he was talking about in terms of, little logos and big logos, which I relate to, in being in time terms, existential versus existential, with ending in ELL versus ending in AL. And with the later Heidegger, the truth of beings versus the truth of being with a Y. And so with both of them, kind of a thing I've said before with some of the other essays, I didn't have time to memorize the whole path he goes along.
Yep.
First we translate it like this, then we translate this, then we translate that. But I enjoy what I'm reading because I'm fitting it in with how I understand Heidegger. And I think, okay, I understand what he's trying to say here. And yeah, sometimes he gets a little mystical. I see that more as a catechism thing, where you're just repeating phrases over and over again, and they kind of get ingrained. And if I don't know who attended Catholic Church decades ago when people were just mumbling in Latin, but that's the sense I get from a lot of Heidegger when he gets repetitive. Is it's that kind of intonation.
I'm thinking of an example of what you're talking about. I think there's a place in the Heraclitus one, if I'm not mistaken, where he almost repeats himself at the beginning of like every line of 3 in a paragraph or something. Maybe it's actually in the Anaximander one, but usually that's less the passage he's reflecting on and more his own thing, right? Yeah, but go ahead.
And I think that there's a lot in Being in Time of that, where he's just repeating. And if you look at the German and the use of sein in so many different senses, and you get the feeling that it's not just written down, there's an oral element to what he's doing, and he's reading it out to his students. So
he's declaiming it with a different accent on different syllables to stress different things and so on. Yeah.
So those are my first impressions.
Yeah. I think, by the way, that your comment that in the Anaximander fragment he's the most reaching in his etymologies and interpretation is entirely just. I think the meat of that chapter is his intro stuff about his own thing and his wrap up of putting all of this in the context of like the development of Greek metaphysics. The actual substance of the engagement with the Anaximander fragment itself, the interpretations are definitely pushed, and you can give an entirely, I don't know, not entirely different. You can give a somewhat different reading that stays closer to the text and seems to explain what Anaximander was actually saying and doing there. And in light of that, reconstructible thing, which is aided by what he did, but you can see how much of the stuff is things he's added. But he also spends a significant portion of that chapter just giving an understanding of being out of one ianta occurring in a passage in Homer, completely, which he just is relating to the they in the fragment, right? He thinks the they in the fragment means the beings or ta'anta, and so then he'll give you, a reading of what ianta means in Homer. when the word isn't even in the passage we're actually translating, but it's so central to what he's doing that he sees it in the pronoun the they. But yeah, fair that it's pushed that way. So would you be willing to, if we wanted to slow down and do this over 4 sessions, would you be okay with that, or is that?
Yeah, I'm good with slowing down. So if next one we just want to do
The Heraclitus thing?
one more essay instead of
Okay.
2, I'd be
Well,
cool with that.
okay, well, we can come back to it at the end, but what the possibilities are, we could have the next one be doing just one essay, the Parmenides. We could also have it be that we, do a more thorough treatment of the Heraclitus passage next time, and giving Joe a chance to read it and more time, and we can spend more of the time this time on the intro stuff. I mean, if people want to talk about the Heraclitus fragments, I'm always willing to. It's my favorite Heraclitus fragment, one of my top 3 favorite pre-Socratic fragments. So always willing to talk about that if people want that. And you had no trouble getting the book or anything like that. You already had it in the Paths book, right? Got it.
Yeah, and I have the 2 Heraclitus and Parmenides are also on my website.
Okay.
If anyone wants to read them online.
That's actually a great resource. I know that Jim Litton was asking for that. He hadn't found a version of it on the web. So if you could put a link somewhere, I will definitely share that with Jim. That would help him, because he was waiting to get the book from Amazon. It hasn't come yet.
Okay, so I'll add it to this current meetup. I don't think
that sounds perfect. Yeah, that sounds perfect.
I'll add a comment with links to the text.
Great, Joe.
I was just going to comment that I'd like to go to the Heraclitus next,
yes,
so that we don't have to go over. Well, unless I might very well profit by talking about it before I read it.
I understand.
But at least that would be the one I'd be coming to next, unless we have like a 4 or 5 week gap, in which case that's too much time. So I would definitely read them both.
I understand. I'm not expecting that, but I want to hear from others and see if other people have already done all the reading and they really want to talk with Heraclitus, because what they're all completely focused on. We got to defer to that a little bit. But if not, I'm just as soon slow down and give these things more thorough treatment. Dan.
So I read this book about 2-3 years ago, and I read it a second time. I finished it about a week ago, so I'm done with this. And let's see, I think since then, since like 2-3 years, during the last 2-3 years, I also read other, like there's a Parmenides book. I read that one. There are 2 Heraclitus book. I read those 2. And there is one with, I think on Parmenides and Anaximander. There is another book, and I read that also. So for me, it was more like, reading this book, rereading it in the context of what we are discussing these days, like when Greek thinking fall into metaphysics, was it Aristotle, was it Plato, was it earlier? So I read it with that in mind. And also it's interesting to read this after the contribution, Heidegger's book, and get a glimpse on. It's nothing more for me to say than this. Cannot hear you.
Oh. Sorry, do you have some background noise where you are, or?
Yes, that is it's a coffee shop.
I got you. Okay, I understand now. I wasn't sure if you were, just listening to music on the side, but a coffee shop makes perfect sense. Yeah, fair. Okay, Craig is coming back. Sorry, Craig, you want to jump in?
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Amazon driver put the packages on the porch instead of in the garage like he's supposed to.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get it before they get stolen.
It's raining and as well too, yeah.
Yeah, so not always the best. The biggest problem I had with the reading, I did get the reading done, was context. Put it simply, when I looking at like Rovelli's book on that, an Aximander that's got a lot of pages on it and a whole lot of stuff about writings and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Which I find are largely pretty much derivatory. And then you get to Heidegger talking like the Anaximander fragment is the only piece of Anaximander we actually really have directly from him. And then he goes to say, well, it was probably a mistranslation by the other guy in parts of it. I needed to get some context. So I dug into Nietzsche, I dug into Jaspers, I dug into a number of others to try to get a little bit more context on it. And part of what I found was this frustration that we have imposed our disciplinary distinctions onto the past.
Yep.
So we don't talk about Greek religion because that's Greek religion. We talk about Greek metaphysics because that's what it is now. We don't talk about poetry because they're shunned by the metaphysicians because they're not thinkers, they're poets. And I thought, how much of this is our own fractured disciplinary structure being imposed on what may have been a little bit more uniform in terms of a progression of development in this so-called axial age that Jasper's made big shit about in at least one attempt at an interdisciplinary approach. So I was happy to see Homer finally come up, 100 plus years pre-Anaximander as potential reference. I was missing Hesiod, and I felt like we were almost counting angels on the head of a pin by only looking at the fragment and only looking at Heidegger's view of the fragment without having any other context really presented to try to round the whole picture out. So that was the frustration I had. Agreed to the, at least in this copy, the glossary is a German to English. It's not a Greek to English or even Greek to German. So I was, had to make a little too much use of the lexicon. And then I finally just gave up because when you get to some of the terms in the lexicon, there's 30 different possible meanings, out of which Heidegger has pulled like meaning number 20 as the one he prefers. So it was a frustrating reading, not knowing my Greek grammar that well and how to define the various tenses of a term and such as that was frustrating. But I did kind of get through it. I liked the conclusion he came to, the extent to which that is him trying to justify after the fact where he went with meaning and time or something to that effect. I think is debatable too. I felt like he might have been stretching a little bit there, but it was worth looking at the way in which we have gone down a narrow path in what he calls philosophy without looking at other things. And when we get to the Heraclitus, if we get a chance to get to that, I mean, the Anaximander was almost half the book as it was. The other three are much shorter. So I got no problem with just doing an Anaximander today and doing maybe 2 of them next time and finishing off with the last one and thoughts and stuff and conclusions. The again, as I got to the Heraclitus, I'm jumping to a different arena, which is the Book of John and the discussion of logos there, and which is much later, but there's still a lot of the sense of hearing the word. In the beginning, there was nothing but the word, and which word is that? Which logos is that? Quite fascinating to look at, but I couldn't find a lot of people spending any time on context. And if anything, Heidegger was narrowing down into his own little tunnel. So that's my overview of the book at this point.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's definitely tons to say about logos in its meaning in Heraclitus alone, let alone its later history, because it definitely has later history, and it's gone through a period where it became kind of the most important order word of the Stoa before it influenced the New Testament period. But sorry, I want to give Peter a chance to, he has his hand up and wanted to react to something you were saying, Greg.
Yeah, so just regarding Anaximander, yeah, this is the only fragment we have of his. That's a direct quotation. But a lot of the later Greek physicists talked about him a lot. He wrote a book called On Nature, and he's like the second of the natural philosophers. Thales also wrote a book called On Nature, and it was quoted a lot. And so if you're interested in Anaximander, the Italian physicist Carlo Rovelli, who's now like a best-selling author,
He's got it.
wrote a book.
Yeah.
His first book is on Anaximander and what we know of him from all the other Greek sources. And there's quite a bit there.
Yeah, that's why I had to go back to that. But again, that's physics and natural science. So Heidegger doesn't give a shit about that. And that was the kind of sense I got here. But that's what I was kind of struggling with is here's Rovelli's book, which is coming out in a new edition next month. And it's got a lot of stuff in it that as a physicist, I'm much more interested in because I'm seeing Anaximander almost preceding a lot of the work on interconnectedness and complexity theory that had been ignored and shunted, and the fact that there is no object other than its interaction and their interrelationship with the rest of everything around it. I thought Anaximander was probably onto something way back then, but that's nothing that Heidegger would care about. So that was part of the context issue too.
Yeah, and there's stuff on Anaximander from the doxographers, from the summaries of the Physiologoi, from the Lives of the Philosophers kind of people, but also in a significant amount in Aristotle. Aristotle gives him quite a bit of conversation in a metaphysics where he's talking about it in the metaphysics, not the physics, but he does relate it to his physics. Heidegger is critical of looking at him solely in the physical lens, because he thinks that was already a late Hellenic version of the same pigeonholing you're talking about, and that at the time of Anaximander, these things were less separated. And that's true of some of the other people who are later thought of as physiologoi. I'm thinking of Empedocles in particular. Doctrines on nature, doctrines on being, things that we would call metaphysics, relation of that to previous mythological attempts to discern underlying thoughts and mythological traditions, those sorts of things, were all a much more integrated activity, so to speak, and was often expressed in poetry than the later attempt to say these people over here are scientists in this discipline that we those of us who are interested in physics read, and these people over here are, in a different division of the university, right? That there wasn't any university yet, so there were no such divisions. But yeah, we can come back to some of the things about context and a less pushed reading of Anaximander fragment, putting it together with what we know about his most characteristic doctrine from some of the other sources Peter's talking about. But when we get to this substance, is it Guy or Guy?
It's Guy.
Guy, okay, Guy, please welcome and
French pronunciation.
Got it.
So thank you. And Jace, I might understand you speak Greek.
I mean, I read Greek. I wouldn't say I speak Greek.
Okay, good. You read Greek. That's great. So what brings me here? I organize the Orange County Philosophy Group, and
Okay.
this month we're reading Feyerabend's The Philosophy of Nature, and
Okay.
he goes back to the early Greeks. And that's when I saw your post. It's like, oh, I want to learn about this.
Sure.
So I've had Heidegger's Being in Time on my bookshelf for at least 30 years, and I still have not opened it. I just feel like I'm not ready to read that yet. I agree with both what Craig and Joe said. Craig in terms of the context, Joe in terms of the Greek. The Greek was really hard. It was just bogged me down. I was reading a sentence at a time over and over and over to really try to understand the meaning. I understand the translation part. I've done a translation of the Tao, or not a translation, an interpretation of the Tao.
Yeah.
And so I understand doing that in a poetic way of getting into that mindset and what the meaning is, and getting over the difficulty with literal translations, which really take you in the completely the wrong direction. I'm presently working on a manuscript that is looking at the origin of how did we become self-conscious after we were conscious. So we were conscious beings, but the origin of self-consciousness is what's interesting me. And so from that, there's a couple of things I could say about that, but I'd say we moved from the context of nature, which is what we're trying to get at here. We left the context of nature and we created the context of society, which is what later Greek philosophy is all about. It's really social philosophy, not philosophy of nature. And I think philosophy needs to be reframed with nature as its context. And I really like what Heidegger is saying, that the true subject of philosophy really needs to be beings. If we don't understand that, the rest of it is not going to make any sense. What else did I want to say? Yeah, I'm not metaphysical at all, but I have had a lot of mystical experiences, so I'm open to that. But I don't understand it at all, and I don't have a vocabulary for talking about it. But I don't want to deny the experience. And also, I've had a keen interest ever since the book came out in Julian James's The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. You know, his seeing the difference in self-reference between the Iliad and the Odyssey, I thought was just an amazing observation, and I think gets at our psychology of who we are, how we reframe ourselves. So one of the things that I really liked about this was he's talking about the Greek experience, and the Greeks experienced nature differently than we do today, and that's part of what I'm interested in the reframing from the context of nature to the context of society, that we have a whole different appreciation, a whole different vocabulary. And when we read the ancient Greeks, we're reading it with our present day mindset, and it makes a lot of assumptions that they didn't have, and we lose a whole lot of subtlety that they did have. So trying to regain that, trying to finesse that, I think that's just really important, because big picture, having let go of the context of nature, which had meaning, to moving to the context of society, which is completely arbitrary. And I think the context of society is a direct path to nihilism, because there is no grounded underlying meaning at all. It's all made up, and we've given up the sculpting tool of natural selection, and we've replaced it with public opinion. And so it's like we're just doing ourselves a huge disservice by just following this path without going back and rechecking the assumptions, and I think reframing all of the basic assumptions that we need to. I think we need to start philosophy all over again, and with that, I think we need to start psychology all over again, because psychology starts with the later Greeks, and we already have all these assumptions about who we are, what human nature is. And I think human nature is really the thing we need to study. That's the pivotal argument. If we can understand what human nature is, then we can build both a psychology and a philosophy that's grounded in fact, and not just arbitrarily made up according to what society we live in, depending on where and when we're born. All right, I'm going to shut up.
Yeah, I get it. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff there. I mean, we do try to, if I can put it this way, big picture concerns that everyone brings to the table can be a little bit different, and we try to stick a little bit closer to the particular topic we're talking about. I mean, the stuff you're talking about the tendency to understand things in terms of a society which seems to have this arbitrariness of time and place. A lot of that was kind of some of the subject matter that was being discussed in the diagnosis of Nietzscheanism as Nietzschean nihilism in the last meetup we had on this in this one. Although there's a definite take on that Heidegger has, which is also sort of the subject there. But if you're interested in that aspect of when the frame becomes the social, when the social frame becomes the constructed, when the constructed becomes a human project for human purposes that have a kind of arbitrariness or will about them, that's kind of the Heideggerian diagnosis of where Nietzscheanism at the end of metaphysics drops us, so to speak. And the question that we left last time with is that something which has which is a recent development, or is that something which is more deeply embedded in the traditions of metaphysics and Western philosophy, right? When we go back to reading these things, not all of us have the same modern assumptions, because some of us have been, trained on Heidegger and trained on ancient philosophy and so forth to a considerable extent, and the result we have some distance from the if I can put it this way, the typical cultural assumptions of our time. Doesn't mean we're completely independent of course, but not everyone's going to be coming at it from the same point of view. In terms of the turn to the human things to and away from nature, this of course is Socrates' own understanding of his own activity. That in his case, not because he thought it was the key to everything, although it might be that too, but as an element of humility. He did not think he could understand the heavens and nature, but he thought if he applied himself to it, he might be able to understand something about himself. But anyway, that's just a traditional understanding of what's involved in the Socratic turn. But I mostly agree with Craig, though, that although the pre-Socratic philosophers are thought of as more focused on understanding nature, the reality is they were already very much involved in the understanding of the relationship between nature and mind, both mind as something that understands nature, something like mind or purpose in nature as well, and metaphysics. The predecessors are have a doctrine of mind, a doctrine of the unlimited, a doctrine of being, a doctrine of becoming, and all of those are not terms simply for nature. They're meant to be more inclusive than that. And that's kind of what Heidegger is getting at in this book when he's trying to trace out this history of metaphysical structure, which is kind of a large historical structure, which he thinks is launched in this period of the Greeks, and then goes through the Socratic period and the Socratic turn and the Aristotelian logicification, if I can put it that way, but is still the persistent structure in which Western thought lives and remains in the modern time. And the question is the from Heidegger's point of view, Nietzsche is the end of that progression, the end of that metaphysics, where it comes out in the end in something like the social construction view you just described. And the question is, how necessary is that consequence, right? Is it implicit in the beginning, or is it in the structure of metaphysics itself, or is it a more recent turn within it? And related to that are questions of how much did the early Greeks see of his own problems, his own concerns about meaning of being, etc. If he's doing some of his own attempted refounding of some of these things, replunging down to the base level of what these concepts mean. How much of that is stuff that's new to these people, things that they missed? How much of it is stuff that they already saw, and that where we have to go to school with them instead of the other way around? The assumption coming into this book from the previous essay is something like there was already something missing being as opposed to the being of beings in Greek metaphysics. I don't know if that will survive the book, but that's sort of where we were coming from going into this out of the previous essay as an assumption. Anyway, just laying out some of the groundwork, what the issues are in play. These are fine things to worry about. I want to give, I think, Jim. Oh, sorry, you want to react?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for that. That was very clear, and I appreciate you putting it all together in that way. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So, Jim, I know you didn't do the reading because I talked to you about it last night, but I wanted to let you know that Pete says he has the second, third, and fourth essays in our reading, everything that besides what we're doing today, on his website. So you can find them in an e-text form. Without
Oh, that's fabulous. Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, so he's going to put up a link to this meetup for you can find that. I know you were asking about that last night, and I didn't know what they were, but Pete has them, so we can hook you up.
Yes, I already added it to this meetup meeting. I added it as a comment.
Wonderful.
Okay, great.
All right, so we've gotten through kind of first reactions. There's at least a couple things I want to talk about in terms of context things. About an Aximander fragment in particular, and then go through at least a little bit of for the Anaximander fragment part, particularly what all is going on in this essay, because it's not just the analysis of the Anaximander fragment, right? There's a whole bunch of preparatory stuff about historiography, then there's a whole bunch of positioning of his own philosophy and what this activity means to him. Then he starts in the translation. The translation is more radical. He goes all the way through the translation, and then at the other side, he starts connecting it to all kinds of bigger issues in Greek metaphysics with these very rapid connections of big thoughts in a manner that would remind you of like Hegel's Science of Logic or something. And that's sort of what those things then tied a little bit back into his own activity stuff is kind of how he rounds out the end of the essay. I want to mention one other thing. When he's doing the interpretation of Anaximander himself, he starts with his interpretation from Homer, which is not even about any word that's in Aximander itself, right? It's there's a they referred to in the part of the saying he wants to interpret that he reads as being referring back to some previous lost clause that said ta'anta, the beings, and that he therefore wants to go find an interpretation of the beings to put in the place of that pronoun in the fragment itself. And so that sends him off to Homer and investigating what being means to the Greeks. Obviously, a heroic reading that you get in one passage in Homer for Ianta with an E isn't quite the same thing as a they that occurs in an Aximander. And just the fact that both of them are in the same language and 150 years apart doesn't tell you that they, mean the same thing, because thinkers are allowed to differ on these things. So this is part of what I mean by this being a kind of reaching interpretation. But on the Greek part, I want to give people a chance to ask about the specific Greek words. I have another comment there on translation in particular. A point was made about literal translation not always being the best. In the case of Heraclitus, literal translation is almost impossible. I don't think this is much less of an issue with Anaximander, but Heraclitus was famous even in ancient times for people who were native speakers of his own language as the obscure. He was Heraclitus the obscure. And the reason is he delighted in packing multiple meanings into short phrases, right? If you only see one reading in a Heraclitus fragment, you're reading it wrong. He put at least 6 in there, right? So unless you've unpacked unless you've got at least 6 heads of snakes coming out of the can is still closed, right? When it comes to Heraclitus. So, that almost is an aid to people for whom the translation problem in a pure language sense is a problem, because all the associations you can read into the single word taken by itself that you can imagine are probably there. If you understand the language well enough for the grammar to lock down, it has to mean exactly this. This grammatical rule means that this construction has to point in exactly this direction. It can't point to all these other meanings. That can help you narrow meanings in a simpler writer than Heraclitus. But Heraclitus is writing in this very terse, expansive way with the big words sounding next to each other with very little connecting tissue, precisely so that all those arrows can point in every possible direction. He wants the explosion of all the possible meanings. That's how he gets something freighted and weighty that can be read multiple ways. And we'll definitely get to that when we get to the Heraclitus fragment. But every single word in a Heraclitus fragment has to be pondered over in terms of how can you put together the others. And you shouldn't assume that if I just knew which declension it was in, it would collapse this to one meaning. It won't collapse to one meaning. Now, in the case of an Aximander, it might collapse to only a few meanings. But if you're talking about Heraclitus, the multiple meaning way of writing it's his stock in trade. It's his favorite thing to do. Parmenides is in between. There'll be some places where he has that sort of freighted, weighty, and other places where he's just single meaning precise, if you get me. Let's start with some of the actual translations of the Anaximander fragment. So the first one he's given on the first page is Nietzsche's translation. Whence things have their origin, there they must also pass away according to necessity, for they must pay penalty and be judged for their injustice according to the ordinance of time. So if you read that and you think that Heidegger's about to translate it, you might think that the place where he's going to focus is wow, he said time at the end. He's probably obviously being understood in the category of time. So this is, clearly going to be right up his street, right? It's not being understood in the category on the background of the good, as in Plato. It's going to be being understood on the background of time, way back in Anaximander. Well, look, it's the same thing that Heidegger is coming out at the end of Being and Time and basic problems of phenomenology. But he doesn't focus on that much at all, that part of it at all. All of his emphasis in his own interpretation is on the necessity and the penalty judged for injustice according to ordinance. The time barely rates. The next point is I think it's on 29. He gets to he doesn't think that the whole thing, is it 29? It's a little bit earlier. He doesn't think that the whole thing is the actual Anaximander. He thinks that it's been padded out with interpretation around it, and that there's a smaller saying that is the actual saying from him. Where is this? If you remember what I'm talking about. Right. Sorry. He basically takes it down to a much smaller fragment. That is the only part he seems to. Yes. Okay. So this is on page 40. I'm sorry. According to necessity, for they pay one another recompense and penalty for their injustice. In his reading, everything before and after that is commentary and gloss by the later people quoting it. And this is the only part that he thinks is linguistically distinct enough as Anaximander's that it's probably the original. And he thinks that all the rest of the language around it is probably put there by the commentators that are quoting it. Because when one Greek is quoting another in a philosophical work, they don't just put quotation marks around when the other person starts talking. They say, you know, as Anaximander said in his book on nature, you know, something like this, some intro from himself to set it up, and then he gives the, you know, the weighty line from the authority, and then continues. So where it begins and ends can be indistinct. But according to Heidegger's reading, the part which is definitely an Aximander as opposed to gloss is according to necessity for the pay one of the recompense and penalty for their injustice. So that means he's leaving off the ordinance of time part that you might think he's very interested in. And the according to necessity part is the beginning of it. He's going to make much of the fact that the according to necessity is an interpretation of, or translation of, this word kreon, which he's going to interpret in a very pushed way as usage. We can talk about what he actually means by that usage, but it's a very pushed reading. The ordinary meaning of kreon is necessity, but it's also rule. Kreon is the name of a particular legendary king of Thebes before Oedipus, and his name means ruler, right? Kreon means something like ruler, necessity, cannot not be, must be, compulsion. It has the general sense of something that has to be that way, right? And so it has the sense of necessity as well as a sense of rule. But that's just for the Greek, independent of his maybe push interpretation of it. When he gives you his final interpretation, he puts in this little phrase about the surmounting of injustice. There's no surmounting of in the Greek, right? He even puts it in parentheses because he knows he's adding it, right? The justice and injustice and paying penalty is there in the Greek. The paying penalty you can definitely translate differently, because the paying can also just be giving, and the penalty can be something like reward. I'll give you a reward, is what you say to the person as you send them to prison, right? And the somewhat ironically meant, you know, what you deserve may be the best closest to a phrase in English, right? I will pay you what you deserve. I will give you what you deserve, right? And I will give you what you deserve in a penal context can mean justice, and it can mean penalty. The to one another refers back to the they. I think that Heidegger's interpretation that the they probably refers to ta'anta, or the beings, is not bad. I think that it's quite likely. It is a reach on his part that he knows what the pronoun would be referring back to is, but it fits the reading of the whole passage that and the rest of what we know about Anaximander, that he would be talking about this sort of thing as the way the different beings are related to one another. Why do I say this? The distinctive teaching that Anaximander is known for is that all of the beings are derivative from the unlimited. There is an unlimited, an infinite, a without distinction, in which each of the beings merely subsists temporarily. And that's really what this is about. This is about the temporary subsistence of the beings in the background of the infinite and unlimited. Joe, question?
Yeah, I almost had the image of, you know, think about a lazy Susan type of serving table, okay? And it would go through a proscenium arch, more or less. I'm just inventing this metaphor. And behind, on the other side of the arch is great fog. So you can't see into it.
Mm-hmm.
But around on one side, as the turntable turns, beings sort of emerge and come out into presence.
Mm-hmm.
And they persist for a while as they take their turn on the turntable, and then they go back into oblivion, but they don't disappear. They continue to exist eternally because they came out of infiniteness, and that means time is infinite, and that means they don't die, right? So they're always there, and they just go around in a circle, but sometimes they're in presence where you can see them because they're on your side of the fog. and then they rotate back again and get back into oblivion.
Only
wondering, is
partly,
that-
so only partly true for what we know of Anaximander, right? You could definitely imagine a Platonist thinking of the forms that way, because there would be something eternal about them. And Aximander seems to have more of this idea that the particular things are subsistent patterns in a eternal stuff, right? Every particular thing has its place in presence, in the light, for the length of its while, only by borrowing space, matter, energy, form from the infinite background of the universe itself, being itself, right? The concretized particular is a temporary usurping formation made out of eternally unchanging. The eternally unchanging, call it matter, call it space, call it underlying, whatever. The things which we think of as the beings merely subsist within the matrix of the eternally unlimited, right?
Yeah.
So the contrast is unlimited. The contrast is unlimited is something like matter, mass, energy, being, space all together. That's the unlimited. And the particular beings are particular because they have limit, because they have been delimited. So
yeah.
So the specific nature of a being in the plural and in the particular is that it is limited, that it is finite. And the particular virtue or element of being with a capital B, being unrestricted, is that it is infinite. So the being's distinction for an Aximander is also the infinite finite distinction. And that means he understands the finite beings as temporary formations, little knots and swirls of whatever the underlying stuff is. And with that understanding, according to necessity, for they pay one another recompense and penalty for their injustice, the reading of that makes sense with this understanding, there's no surmounting of injustice involved in it. There's not even any notion that fate apportions the appropriate while to each of these things necessarily. That's Heidegger is right that that's a thought you get in Parmenides, but not so much. It's not so much evidence here. He doesn't say Moira. He doesn't say fate is the thing which is dispensing these proportions to things. The idea that there was a fate that dispensed the proportions of time to things was part of the Greek mythological background. That fate was above the gods, right? The overall order above the gods was a fate that assigned the proportions to things. Sorry, Craig, question or comment?
Just a comment. Part of the issue with context, just to go back to it, is Nietzsche's Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, which is the one that's referenced for the original translation. Hilarious paragraph in which Nietzsche puts that in. Each single thought and its form is a milestone upon the path to the highest wisdom. Thus, with lapidary impressiveness, Anaximander says upon one occasion, then there's the fragment.
Yes.
Enigmatic proclamation of a true pessimist, oracular legend over the boundary stone of Greek philosophy. How shall we interpret you? I thought that was hilarious, the way Nietzsche comes in with this bombastic presentation of about one piece of Anaximander, which is actually the only piece we have.
Yes. I mean, I think that in the case of Nietzsche, he is inclined to read his own understanding of things back into the fragment, right? But the justification for seeing the infinite finite as the being's distinction in Aximander, I think, is pretty sound from everything else we hear about him. It's the thing that he is famous for, and it's what set him apart from the earlier Ionian and the later Parmenidean Heraclitean schools. But I was getting at the point of the justice and injustice. The Heidegger tries to read this as according to usage, and rec and the justice and the surmounting of injustice. There's none of that dipole of justice and the surmounting of injustice in the original Greek, right? And Aximander Anaximander's notion of what counts as justice here is more like everything that is a usurper. So when it's overthrown by the next usurper, that's the justice it deserved, right? Nothing finite deserves to be eternally. Everything finite is a squatter on the matter and space where it exists. And thus, when it is supplanted by the next, that's only what it did to the thing before, and it's justice. The eternal justice, the eternal order, is the succeeding of things by one another, right? And so that's the there could be an echo of tragic in that. There can be an echo of pure materialist in that. There can be an echo of fatefulness in that, if you like. But in the fragment itself, it's just called paying each other justice and injustice, with a complete lack of emotion as to one versus the other. Justice and injustice are not said as terms of distinction that say the arrow of becoming is headed towards justice and away from injustice. Nothing like it, right? Finite being itself is an unjust temporary usurpation that is undone by the next unjust temporary usurpation, right? And what eternally stands in that is the necessity of the succession, right? So the according to necessity is that the finite things dissolve and the infinite remains, right? The infinite field on which it happens.
Sort of like a Feynman diagram is always finite. It's an event that takes place, and the field behind it is always there. I mean, that's
Yes.
the kind of thing that's starting to come up to that. And anything that you can describe with a Feynman diagram or anything like that is subject to eradication and moving on. And there's no real sense of justice there. That's just the way things are.
Yes, but he's definitely taking the human sense of justice and those things, and he's saying this is what its natural, not even basis. This is what its natural equivalence or something is. Sorry, Guy, I can't pronounce it in French. Guy? Guy. Hand up, so please, your comment.
Well, I find this interesting because there's two ways of seeing this, and what's being discussed is an existential context where we're looking at a lifespan of coming into being and then going out of being. But the way I was reading it was more along a mystical presence context, which is an experience of coming in and out of being, not in terms of a lifespan, but in terms of like an intensity of experience that it's like my being, my presence can recede and become invisible in social interaction, but I can become very, very present.
I understand what you're saying, but just to be clear, I mean, at least as I'm reading it, and Aximander is not in any way restricting this to anything like human experience. He's talking about literally every finite thing that exists, right? Every finite thing that exists, right? Trees, chairs, tables, artifacts, natural objects, molecules, atoms. They're all temporary patterns and things. The only thing that's eternal is the underlying matrix from which they are made.
Okay, so his context is existential then, not experiential.
I don't even know that it's particularly existential. It could even be physical. But sorry, Pete, go ahead. Pete, got it.
Yeah, I had to mute myself.
Sure.
So my physical analogy for what he's saying, the apeiron is entropy, and for something to presence for us, it's a low entropy area. So usually there's been some biological process that has created a flower, or a craftsperson has created a pot out of the mud. So that's my physical modern analogy.
I understand, but that his word for that order is just justice, Dike, right? The particular patterns, the particular orderings are just little bits of justice that are all succeeded by injustice.
Right, and well, what does he mean by justice? And it's obviously not a moral.
No, justice means order to the
Yeah.
it's order as merely low entropy is a modern information theory way of thinking about it. But order as some properly structured arrangement in some sense of proper for some sense or purpose is sort of the original Greek, what the original Greek hearing in Dike is, right? That's why it can mean justice or just order. You can have Dike in how you arrange things in your house, right? So it has that sense of order. Sorry, go ahead.
And also the modern technological Heideggerian interpretation that the Gestell is our ability to order up everything as the dominant understanding of being, that now things appear to us because we can order them up. So maybe
Yes.
that's the sense of
yes, and in the Nietzschean version of that, right? They're literally, if I can put it this way, conjured as the meaning nuggets they are by our own purposes, right? They are pragmatically assembled things that are directly related to our values, to a Nietzschean, right? The categories in which we think about them, the categories in which we put them, are all related to our human purposes and possibilities of interaction with them, and as they are ta pragmata, right? They are things we can interact with. And that's, some of that is even a existential understanding you get in Heidegger. It's definitely an understanding you get in Nietzsche, who's trying to move, who's pushing these things towards there's a projected and artful element in each of them. But I don't think that's there yet here in the Greeks. I don't think they have that thought there yet. It's not, they're not seeing these things as projections. Sorry, Joe.
It's up behind my mic. Yeah, my eye is drawn to the word justice or injustice or justice. And I understand there's one old meaning for justice, meaning to each their own, to their own share. Especially if you're not doing equality as your rule, to each their due is one way of saying the same thing. So if you have a cookie cutter world, I mean, a world, I call it that. The stuff of forever is just like cookie dough, and we have a cutter here that cuts out little, figures and things and objects, beings, being cut out. But when I look away or finish with them, they all dissolve back into the big mass of dough. That's justice. They're going to where they ought to go, back to where their level or their place is. So I get this idea of an equilibrium sort of a concept of justice here from this passage.
Yes, but it's not necessarily equilibrium, because it's just the sequence of change. I want to give Dan a chance and then back to Guy.
Actually,
Dan.
You spoke in terms of finite and infinite, and I think at least Heidegger is trying to stay away from that. He mentioned, like, I know he stay away from infinite, but also like after a point he stay away from finite. Like to him, after a point he no longer mentioned, like, even that at that point finite is something like boundary shape, something like that, and then infinite is not something like related to what we tend to like mathematical infinite or so on. It's more like it's complete or something like that. And I think when we talk in terms of finite, infinite, already talking metaphysics. And the question, I know Heidegger stay away from that. The question is that kind of thing in the text there or not?
So it's not in our particular passage, but it's in Aximander. He is known as the person who said that the being is the apeiron, the unlimited. The term he used was literally the unlimited, an a privative in front of unlimited. It's the same thing of where you are found in a Platonic dialogue without a way out, and therefore you're without means. It's the same kind of unlimited, but there had been previous physicoi who had said, all is water or all is air, and he said, no, all is the unlimited. That's what he's famous for. So yes, that's metaphysical thinking, absolutely, but it's Anaximander's metaphysical thought, right? His genuine metaphysical thought is that he can understand the being of the beings as the unlimited, right? He's not saying
Okay.
being itself in Heidegger's term. He's trying to talk about the being of beings, but to Anaximander, the being of beings is the unlimited, and the character of its interaction with the limited thing, the limited ta'anta, the limited beings that are, is that it is crayon. It is by necessity and ruling. There's a by necessity and ruling that the unlimited does over all of ta'anta, over all of the individual things that are. And that's his metaphysical thought, right? It's his place in Greek metaphysical thought, is that he's the guy who said the proper word for the being of beings is the unlimited. So we know that from people like Aristotle and others who talk about him and what he's known for. In the fragment itself, he's then talking about that being the case, that being his understanding. How are the beings with one another? What is the interrelationship among the beings? And the interrelationships among the beings is, according to necessity, they penalty to each other for their injustice according to the ordinance of time, right? That's the, each lingers their while. I mean, I think Heidegger's gloss on this, as each of the beings lingers its while and then departs, is accurate. It's not even a finiteness experienced as human. It's a finiteness experienced as whatever finiteness in time is experienced as part of finiteness itself, right? As part of the nature of the beings as opposed to being. And there's no question that this is metaphysics. It is, but it's Greek metaphysics. It's early Greek metaphysics. Sorry, Gui, your thought or comment?
Yes, my second comment was this sounds very much like the Tao. The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao.
Mm-hmm.
And my first comment was how we frame this, and I think justice, framing it in the context of nature, is completely different than justice framed in the context of a society. And I think he's talking about the context of nature, not the context of society. So
possibly, but he's really talking about it in an unlimited sense. He's not framing it only as nature. There were some people afterwards that assimilated him to the physicoi and put him alongside them and said he must be only talking about nature. But that's kind of a later imposition. We have no sign that he thought of it that way at all. He thought of this in metaphysical generality. He thought he was talking about finite being as such, right?
So I'm having a bit of a problem with describing this as metaphysical. I'm not seeing the metaphysics in this. It seems like he's making a very straightforward statement. He's not including anything supernatural or.
Well, I understand, but that's not the meaning of the word metaphysics. I mean, metaphysics is a term of art from Aristotle, and it's a particular subject matter that philosophy deals with. That's about what is true of all the being, what is true of being as such. Right.
Okay, in that context. Okay. I'll accept that context. That's fine.
Anything that is meant to apply to being unrestricted, not to a single category of beings, is to Aristotle what metaphysics is. Right. Yep. So that includes logical categories, includes the principle of contradiction, because there's all kinds of things which Aristotle thinks of as being metaphysics because they're not about a particular subcategory of things that are.
I understand. It's just a different definition of metaphysics than I was using, but I understand. I understand.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Did we get through the questions about just this push versus unpush reading of what's there? I think that one of the reasons that one of the things that Heidegger does manage to bring out, and this we're going to go back to the reading of Eonta from Homer, is the way in which this this notion of the finiteness of being is very much in a temporal context, right? He's not saying the beings are finite because they're smaller than the universe, right? In space, right? That's not the sense of finitude he's thinking of. There is that as well, but the special sense of finiteness that the finite beings have is their temporariness, the fact that they're temporary, right? And that means both affected by the category of time, and it means finite in time. When Heidegger wants to explain where he thinks the on, anta, and ianta mean, he's giving this explanation of why did the Greeks say on and anta for being and beings? And the point is that these are on their own, they're just participle endings. And that's something that might not be obvious to people without the Greek. In the original sort of tragic, form of them, the older form of them, there's an E in front of it. It's eon and eonta. So an eon is something like an R, something that R's, something that is, right? It's one of them that is, right? So you've got an E and you've got a one of in front of it. And the anta is many, right? It's like several ones that are. So it's like you're saying R's without rolling them or trying to sound like a pirate, right? So the on and anta is like an R and several R's. That's sort of the just grammatically speaking what they're constructed like. And when he goes to a context in which this primitive meaning of eonta appears, it's in Homer, and it's what does the seer Nestor's son know, who knew all that is to be, or once was. That's the characteristic place where you get an eonta phrase, as he's saying he knows, to quote Lord of the Rings, things, things that were, things that are, and things that have not yet come to pass, right? That's the same kind of locution, right? And in that, the things that are is what being means. All three of them are inflections of being, but the R sense of being is the things that are, and it's not now, but it's something like now, an extended now. Heidegger's extended now of the present in the ecstasies of time in basic problems of phenomenology. It's that kind of extended now. And I think that this understanding of what the base meaning of anta, on, and those sorts of things was to the Greeks is correct. I think this is it's an accurate etymology. It's an accurate place of how they're using it. Okay. The word has to, not has to Heidegger, these words sound poetically. What does that mean? It means that they have a meaning and word association and weight to them, independent of just what they're getting from how they're used, something like that, just the conjectural way that they're used. Heidegger is a critic of the later interpretation of being as what you just factor out of all of the beings. And so you have a big pile of beings, and then you take their lowest common denominator and you arrive at being, right? And so it's a mathematical operation of division which arrives at it. He thinks that it's something that has more direct phenomenal meaning than that, and that those later understandings of it are, after the fact logical operation constructions around the primitive word meaning. The primitive word meaning is the things which are as the things which are present, as the things that are around now. And he's going to connect this up to the notion of truth as unveiledness and nature as emerging presence, right? But this notion that there's something like an emerging presence into which the beings present themselves, in which they linger in unconcealment a while, and then they disappear back into concealment. That's the picture of the life cycle of a being, with life in quotes, the timeline of a being in the background Greek metaphysics, we can call it that way. By background, I mean the one that's just freighted there in the language itself, and that you find recurring in all of these thinkers. It's also, you can find traces of it in their mythology and so on. Okay. Questions about any of that? Because I think this is where he's really making his case that there's something like a Greek metaphysics that's about being and that starts around this time and that is a single formation. Because you could easily see all these things as being, just n different possible positions on, m different questions in some, just completely chaotic, disordered thing. And he's saying, no, these people are all talking about the same topic. They're trying to understand what all of the beings are and do, what they all have in common in terms of this emerging into presence, lingering in the light, receding into concealment. Is any of this making sense? I realize, Joe, this is where you were talking about how it seemed mystical and poetical, right? But this is what he's trying to get at, and why it can seem mystical and poetical. He's talking about an experience of what it is for something to be that is experienced by, we would say by our consciousness, apprehending them, but we're generalizing from what we apprehend, right? To what they must be like, that they are apprehendable in this way. Joe?
Well, does that mean that things that are, I won't use the word imaginary, but I'm going in that direction. Things that I understand about myself, about my situation, in which I want to project into my immediate aims and goals. Are those actual real beings in one sense, or are they just ephemeral? Because that's where we're trying to get to, cutting these patterns out. What's actually present to us, as opposed to what's just emerging or disappearing.
So it's a fair question. The reality is the different philosophies differ on these questions. They differ on how they understand what we call subjective phenomena, or how they understand these things as being phenomena, or as being, quote, real, unquote. Whether or not they understand them as being knots of meaning we put together as projections, or they're things which were already there that we merely discovered, right? The philosophies through history differ on the point. What Heidegger is trying to point out here is the subject matter itself, before any of that has entered, before they're making it about where mental objects are, or whether or not the being is idea. To understand something like Plato's thesis that being is idea, he's saying you can only understand that thesis if you understand it as an answer to a question like this, right? And Aximander said the beings, the particular beings, are defined by being limited. And Plato will say, if limited, then have an idea-like outline or shape that is a pattern in them that can be matched by the pattern in the mind. And and this is meant to be for Plato both an explanation of why finite beings have essences, and how veridical understanding can happen when the mind's apprehension and the object themselves coincide. Right? Okay. Is that a correspondence theory of truth in getting started in the way we saw in the Essence of Truth essay? Maybe, right? Whatever else it is. But the point is that if you think of this as the philosophers are trying to lay down discoveries or statements that are true of finite being as such, as a problem that arises from meaning of being, then you see the field in which these people are playing. Right? You see a single field of Greek metaphysics in which the later doctrines of people like Plato and Aristotle slot in alongside these people as living in the same problematic, living in the same set of questions. Does that make sense? Dan?
Yeah, I think in this entire book, one of the argument that Heidegger is making is that, like, there is this fall into metaphysics, but also this happens at the same time with the oblivion of the ontological difference. And then I think to him, as long as we have that insight, kind of we avoid that. And it seems like he's saying that, like, even here there is that, but it's not grasped directly. It's kind of there. It's more hinted or I don't know, like Anaximander sees that or senses it and it's there in the background, but it's not directly grasped. And I think that's kind of like what keeps everything falling into metaphysics, which eventually didn't happen. Like everything fell into metaphysics. And I think it's this keeping that inside the ontological difference.
I understand what you're saying, and he definitely makes the case for this early on in the fragment essay we're looking at. I mean, it's in like on page 26, where this is where people are noticing that he repeats himself several times on the page as though he's saying a catechism, right? As it reveals itself in being withdraws. He says that like over and over again, like a catechism line on page 26, right? And this is trying to make exactly that point, that the beings appearing and being disappearing seem to go hand in hand. But you have to ask how much the fragments he's looking at are evidence of that. And in this book as a whole, how much of it is evidence of that? There's multiple places in this essay where he's already appealing to the the sense of the lightning illumination that he's borrowed from Heraclitus. There'll be things by the end of this book where where the being that never sets will be that from which nature loves to hide in Heraclitus. The point being that there's places here where his own interpretations are pointing out the ongoing direct awareness that some of these pre-Socratics actually do have of the ontological difference and distinction between being and beings. They may not understand it the way he does. They may not understand being as the destining history of a formation or something like that that Heidegger is thinking of. They may only be thinking of the being of beings, but they are definitely thinking not just of the beings. They have something they are understanding over against the beings that is way more general than them, and that is, yes, they recognize that it is itself tends to be hidden by the beings. That's a thought you find in Heraclitus, right? But if someone is pointing out that thought to you, it's not because he didn't notice it, right? Heraclitus notices these things. And so some of the things which Heidegger is pointing out here about being withdrawing behind the appearing beings, it's art. There's an overtone of that already there in Anaximander, although I agree it's very hard to see because it's very obscure and there's very little to go on. In the case of Heraclitus, it's very clear, and we'll see that by the interpretation of the fourth fragment in this book, right? It's very clear that he does see that. That doesn't mean that he has the same understanding of being, of the history of being, or the destiny of the history of being, or something like that Heidegger does. He doesn't. But he does definitely have a notion of a being that is hidden behind the appearance of beings. So does Parmenides. So does Plato. Plato's allegory of the cave is about little else, right? Parmenides' doctrine of the one being beyond the appearances and the appearances being deceptive is about little else. So even this metaphysics, and the metaphysics is what it is, even this metaphysics is not unconscious of the distinction between being and beings. It may not understand it the same way Heidegger does, but it is definitely conscious of that distinction, and it is underlining that distinction all over the place. Reactions.
One more thing. So, like Heidegger will say, like being, like the one with capital B is nothing, I don't know, infinite or in a different dimension or whatever. It's to him is something very concrete, and it's there.
Yes.
It's almost limited in a way. It's something like,
yes,
but it's not a being. And I think he's trying to look for that. And I think he's, to me at least, when I read this first essay, it seems like Heidegger is trying to say like Anaximander is saying something like that. Being that is behind the beings is not like in a different space. It's there with them. It's there. It's give them their beings and.
Yes, and his word for it is usage. He tries to say that this, he tries to translate, he says that kreon is the first word for the being of beings in this history of Western metaphysics, and he tries to interpret it as usage. Usage is this almost economic concept of usufruct. It's like, you get to borrow for your lifetime this thing, but you don't actually own it. You have to give it back, right? And he's saying that's the kind of relationship that he reads into that word that he sees an Aximander saying subsists or persists between being in the unlimited sense and the particular beings. The particular beings get to use a little bit of matter and a little bit of space in their lifetime, but they have to give it back, right? So that's what he means by the usage reading, the usage interpretation, right? I think by necessity and rule are clearer meanings of the word kreon that Anaximander used, but I understand why Heidegger likes this pushed reading of usage for it, because he's trying to get at this notion of the particulars are borrowing something from unlimited being. Okay, now obviously the fact that you can give a formula for its meaning and what it means, and you can, Heidegger would even say, you can see it, you can experience it. To Heidegger, that means that it is concrete, and that means it is not simply infinite, even if Anaximander's word for it is the unlimited, right? And he's going to object to how metaphysical or obscure even the understanding of it as unlimited is. He wants it to be understood in terms of what the experience was behind it and what the words are used to mean. That's how he's trying to make these things phenomenologically real and concrete. He thinks that that's a matter of avoiding highfalutin abstraction and getting down to brass tacks of what we meant by the word, what we meant by the saying. But when these people are trying to bring what their experience of what the being, not just beings, is to language, they are very much on the path that Heidegger himself is trying to go along. He's not saying that's the wrong path. He is saying something like he can see more of that as a whole path than the particular fragment of it they're walking along. Fine, but when he goes, in the later parts of this Anaximander fragment essay, where he goes through a list of all of the ways in which the subsequent thinkers, I'm thinking of page 55, all the subsequent thinkers reacted to or this unlimited in Creon and where it went. This is a second paragraph on page 55. To Creon harbors the still hidden essence of the gathering which clears and shelters. So that's already his own language, right? Usage is the gathering, O logos. That's already referring to Heraclitus. From the essence of logos, thought in this way, the essence of being is determined as the unifying one, or hen. Parmenides is this same hen. He thinks the unity of this unifying one expressly as the Moira, that is fate. Thought from within the essential experience of being, Moira corresponds to logos for Heraclitus. The essence of Moira and logos is thoughtfully imitated, in the Creon of Anaximander. His point there is that there's a same that they're getting at, and that each of these thinkers has their own key poetic words for the experience of being as opposed to the beings, the being that is hiding behind the beings, something like that. And he says this is not a matter of them influencing one another. They're all being influenced by the matter that they're thinking about. They're all being influenced by the being that they're thinking about. Okay, and I think I think the evidence for that is very strong. You may say the only other thing they're being influenced by is the language they share, or something like that. But the language they share and the problematic they're wrestling with is what leads to them talking about the same. Okay. Now there are some really pushed claims in this essay when he's relating this up to his own stuff. He basically says the different interpretations of the same in this fashion is what history proper consists of. He's completely uninterested in political history. He's completely uninterested in social history. The history that matters to him is the history of being, is the history of this sort of thought. And from his point of view, the history of this sort of thought is the backbone on which all the rest of history hangs. Okay. One of the things I want us to pay attention to by the time we get to the end of this book is, do the claims that we had in the Nietzsche essay here about how what we have in the early Greeks is of a same piece with what we had with Nietzsche at the end, in terms of the amount of nothing happening to being nihilism is present in them, does that hold up to the end of this book or not? I'm on the side that it doesn't. And I think even Heidegger can see that by the end of this book. I think Heidegger sees things in Heraclitus that he doesn't see in Nietzsche in terms of amount of access to this, openness to this, or something like that. There are lots of places that are signs that to me, but the most striking one is the fact that when Heidegger wants to explain to you poetically and metaphorically what is happening when thinking happens and translation works and you get the insight, right? He uses Heraclitus's vision of the lightning flash, right? The lightning flash of illumination, right? That's the way in which these insights are discovered, and he borrows it straight from Heraclitus. The lightning he's referring to, by the way, in Heraclitus's own words in the Greek, is just sky fire, fire from heaven, right? That's what lightning is in Greek. And obviously Heraclitus is the guy who will tell us the ever-living fire is what being is. We'll get to that by part 4 of this. So there's something like being as life, fire, activity, energy, something like that, as the underlying in Heraclitus. And for Heraclitus, insight is sky fire. It's of the same stuff. And when Heidegger is talking about the role of man as the shepherd of being as the place or site where being can happen, he's talking about this kind of understanding. He's not talking about something different from this kind of understanding that would replace it or supplant it. He's talking about the kind of things which, Heraclitus is manifestly doing. So I'm pointing out that there's tons of stuff here where Heidegger is reaching to interpret Heraclitus. He's finding things in Heraclitus. Some may dispute how much of it is actually there, but I think most of it is. I think Heraclitus is quite deep. I think he's deeper than at least what we have of Anaximander. But he is not criticizing Heraclitus in the slightest. He is not finding things missing in Heraclitus. There is nothing in here which is equating Heraclitus with the oblivion of being we got from Nietzschean metaphysics at the end of metaphysics in the essay we talked about last time. Right? Yes, they're in the same formation. He can show that there's a continuity of thinking about the same that they have in common, and that makes them part of the same historical trajectory or structure of metaphysics. That's fair. But they're not saying the same thing in it at all, and they don't have the same access within it to something like experience of being. There's a sharp difference between them, and Heraclitus is coming out on top in Heidegger's own readings of these things. Reactions to any of that? I realize we haven't got to the actual Heraclitus fragment, but I wanted to. We've got on some of these things. There's obviously huge. Kind of put it this way, huge consequences that Heidegger sees in this. There's one other thing I wanted to point along the way. I think this actually does happen in the Heraclitus things. When Heidegger wants to translate the word wise in Heraclitus's saying, he calls it the fateful. He substituted the fateful for the wise. Heraclitus said wise, used actual sophon. Heidegger translates the fateful. Why? I put it to you, it's because he thinks that something like the historical fate of these things, this unfolding historical process of discovery or revelation of being to man or something like that, that wisdom is that calling, right? It is what is historical and fateful in that sense that gets to count as wisdom. That's his own thought. That's not from Heraclitus. It's not a translation in that sense. It's his own way of thinking about it. There's no sign that Heraclitus put that accent or valuation on fate or the fateful, or that with that sense of history to it. He just said the wise. Okay, I'm just trying to point out the ways in which there's things here which are peculiar to Heidegger that he's bringing to it, and that some of them don't always sit with some of the broader claims that he both makes at the start of this essay and that he made in the previous essay about how superseded some of this is, right? There's several other things I would point out about this. There's a tendency in Heidegger to denigrate the way of thinking about these metaphysical questions in terms of the common, in terms of the logical, in terms of the. I'm sorry, I don't want to go off this tangent. If Joe has a question, Joe, go.
Are you suggesting in some way almost impugning Heidegger for mistranslating, smuggling a meaning in that without really explaining it to us? That seems a little stark.
So I think what he's doing is what he said he wanted to do in the Aximander thing, which is translate in the other direction himself into this mode of thinking instead of the words to us. He's trying to put himself back in those shoes and see things that way, but he's still bringing himself along, right? And so he arrives there. And when he tries to think Heidegger's thoughts, his mind is still present and it's still his, and it's not Heidegger, it's not Heraclitus's mind anymore. It's his own mind. So some of the things that Heraclitus says, because they're said to him, right, sound different. They don't sound the way they would sound to Heraclitus. They sound the way they would sound to Heidegger. And to Heidegger, wise and fateful rhyme. To Heraclitus, they didn't. Right? So I think that's the way I would characterize it. in terms of the claims he's making, I think some of the claims he makes outside for I'm gonna say outside. When I say outside, I mean I tend to mean in the introductory sections of some of these works, in the conclusion section of some of these works, some of the claims he makes in those places are pushed grander claims of importance or consequence that when he gets to the go this way, to the coal face of actually struggling with each thinker, he doesn't necessarily hold up, right? He's more charitable to these thinkers when he's actually grappling with their specific thoughts than he is when he's standing back, 100 yards away from them, thinking it was part of a giant formation, right? He sees more thoughtfulness in Heraclitus up close when he's struggling with his words and trying to understand them than his general impression of early Greek philosophy from a distance. To me, that's to his credit, right? He gets more just the closer he gets to this thing, right? But it also means that there's something about the broader claims that has to be, put in some appropriate brackets, right? It's not simply true. It's not simply the whole story. Okay, reactions to any of that before I go on to my next? Jimmy boy raised his hand. Jim.
Yeah, do you think that when he gets the distance, you'd say from 100 yards away, he's doing that to help build or as a proof text for his ideas about being in general and what he was referring to in being in time? If so, is he doing it consciously? Like obviously reinterpreting a word, retranslating a word, or is it not sure? He just maybe he's not totally conscious of what he's doing. Is that what you're trying to say?
I think that when he's giving the large sweeping programmatic statements, he's especially trying to guide readers and his spoken audience and lectures towards engagement with his philosophy and towards understanding of the importance of these things, so to speak. And he thinks that those broader sweeping understandings are better guides for how they should think about this or what they should be doing, something like that. And maybe they're also, more stirring rhetoric, or they're more moving rhetoric for that sort of thing. But he's not willing to carry that through to mangling a piece of Heraclitus in a way that is unjust to Heraclitus. When he gets to the actual saying, he's going to be, just to Heraclitus. And if Heraclitus sees something, if Heraclitus sees something about the being that hides behind the beings that Heidegger was proud of as his own insight, late in Being and Time or early in Basic Problems of Phenomenology, and wow, it was already, some of that was already there in Heraclitus. Instead of saying he couldn't have thought that because I'm the one who made it up, 2,000 years later or 2,500 years later, he's going to justly say, actually, Heraclitus has seen this, right? But that doesn't mean he's going to go back and revise everything he said in the programmatic statement at the beginning to, say the eclipse of being started in the Greeks is actually kind of wrong because it only happened for some of the Greeks and it didn't happen for all of the Greeks. And some of the Greeks were on the ball and have things to teach me, right? In my own terms, my whole reaction to this aspect of Heidegger is I want to be more charitable to tradition than I find him being, because I think there's more substance in the tradition than he sees in it. And that's not quite true. He does see it in it, right? There's more substance in the tradition than his programmatic statements of dismissal of metaphysics as an entire thing, for example, lets on. He's learned a ton from historical metaphysics, and he knows it. And one of the things I appreciate about him is how much he can teach us about that. It's very hard to go to these few fragments from a few thinkers like this and put together this much connecting tissue about the one same that they were all thinking about. And he's done a wonderful job of that. So plenty of credit to him for being a guide that can see those things and connect those things over that distance of time and thinking. But also credit to them for having those thoughts in the first place. They're not mutually exclusive, right? Does that make sense?
Yes. And did he ever comment on, let's say, go into deeper commentary on the experience he had of first thinking he made it up, but then discovering later that no, I didn't, and what it was like, what are even the, well, I'll say philosophical or metaphysical implications that he did stumble onto or figure something out that at first seemed an
It's a fair
original
question.
insight.
It's a fair question. Sorry, does someone else want to respond to that? Because I've thought on it, but I don't think he does. I think that there's always one more distinction in his back pocket between, you know, the first beginning and the next beginning, and, you know, what to do after the discovery of Dasein, the experience of being in time, and the understanding of the historical nature of the history of the truth of being, something like that, where he thinks that, you know, he thinks that his full philosophy has more going for it than the things that it has learned from these people in the past, and he never just simply backs off. He never simply backs off that claim, right? That claim remains. So I don't think there's any, you know, place where he says, well, actually, you know, this particular insight that I had was already there in Heraclitus, and so any claims of its originality are false. Instead, it's more like, yes, he saw this, but he didn't see that, right? Which is true, right? There's plenty of things that Heidegger, you know, didn't see in Being in Time himself, and things that Heidegger didn't see until the mid 1930s. I don't find that, you know, someone in, you know, 400 or 500 BC not having seen something that Heidegger didn't see until the mid 1930s as being a stunning criticism of them, right? It's not a requirement for philosophical cogency that you anticipate your successors 2,800 years later, or anything like it, right? So anyway, these are all my own reactions. These are not things he's saying. This is my own reactions to what I like about what he's able to show me in these older thinkers, and my admiration for his ability to show it to me, but also my noticing it doesn't sit entirely well with him claiming that they didn't know what they're talking about. They obviously did know what they're talking about. Craig?
Another thing that was kicking around the back of my head through most of this is maybe a sense from another terrible field, archaeology. We have a few fragments. We have no idea what else there was. We have no idea how they related to anything else that might have been written. For the most part, we have commentary a few hundred years later on stuff that we think may have been extant at some point, but we no longer have access to it. So we're jumping to a lot of stuff based on a few artifacts, and that worries me a little bit, that he may be reading too much into a fragment, to put it simply, without any humility towards the fact that that fragment may or may not be truly representative of the overall thought.
In the case of Anaximander, I think you're right. And in the case of the pre-Socratics as a whole, I'm less worried, because there's a more coherent picture he can paint about how these things hang together in a storyline that has a direction and is going somewhere. And the way in which you can point out with people about whom we know as much as we know about, you know, Heraclitus and Parmenides, for example, where we know a lot more than about Anaximander, right? And the amount we, you know, have commentary on their doctrines in Plato and Aristotle, right? I'm not saying we're on completely firm ground in an archaeological sense, but the story he's putting together here, that there is a single problematic of metaphysics that all of them are wrestling with, and they're trying to talk about this same business, and that they're not simply doxographically disagreeing with one another on, you know, as a Dials would have it, or even as a Nietzsche in his, you know, Tragic Age of the Greeks book would have it. I think he's just sound there. The commonalities of structure, theme, problem, you know, etc., that he's pointing out here they're not only evident in the text, they are a better philosophical reading of what's really going on in the text, and very clearly so, than the stuff you get in, you know, Nietzsche in 1873, or the stuff you get in the you know, Hellenic age doxographers, or you know, lives of the philosophers stuff, right? That's all way shallower philosophy than this. And I think it's just because he's bringing a heck of a lot more philosophical horsepower, informed by a lot of subsequent history, to see. He knows what these things blossomed into, right? He knows what these things became, and he's got a perspective on how important they were as seeds, that he can, he can see stuff in them that shallower philosophers didn't see, and people who are in a single philosophical school didn't see. He's got a synoptic view of the history. The person who's probably closest to that synoptic view before him is Hegel. I'm thinking of stuff in the science of logic in particular, where he's going through history of philosophy, that sort of stuff. That's probably the thing which is like this the most. But sorry, Dan.
Yeah, I would like to mention something. I also read there is that book. It's not. I think it's an easy book. Sojourns when Heidegger is visiting Greece at last, and it's a funny book because he kind of goes there and he visits islands after island, and he's kind of looking for in ruins to see if there is any Aletheia left, and he sees nothing, and there he visits. I think it's Delos, the small island of Delos, and there he is. He still finds it, so it's still there according to Heidegger. It's in the ruins. It's in the what's left from the whatever nature, architecture, whatever is left in the. And I found that very funny and interesting.
We have to go to Delos to see truth in the flesh. Yes. Okay. Sorry, Jimmy had a question.
No, I just probably forgot to bring the hand down.
Okay, that works.
There you
go. Okay. Did Dan just put his hand back up, or is that old?
So, Jason,
yes.
Regard your point of him not being generous to people is that he's like ascribing metaphysics to Plato. That Plato came up with this one interpretation, and after that, all subsequent thinkers through to Nietzsche were stuck in metaphysics. And I think, part of that is style. He's lecturing his students. They've been reading Plato since 10th grade or something. And in a sense, he's got to be confrontational to get them to realize that he's not agreeing with everything that came before him and just adding his next thing. He's trying to take it back. And yeah, Heidegger's thought on it is that with Heraclitus, the understanding of being was still open to where Heraclitus would be amenable to what Heidegger discovered in the 20th century, but that with Plato is actually cut off from that. And we do know that after Plato, Aristotle's already thematized, dogmaticized constant presence that has set up the metaphysics so that Galileo could then change that and create experimental science, and it's still with constant presence. And so we get up to the present day. But your point is that actually Plato's not stuck there. He's a lot more open, and Heidegger's doing a disservice by reading Aristotle's constant presence back into Plato and saying this is the only thing Plato understood. Heidegger's interpretation of the cave myth, allegory, and him forcing the correspondence theory of truth into the Theaetetus, that's actually not there. And Plato's a lot more ambiguous and open to other interpretations of truth besides correspondence theory. And so this is a bad thing that Heidegger's doing. But I think, he's actually, when he's actually reading Plato, he's more generous. It's just when he's,
Yes.
wrapping up the whole of the last 25 centuries. That he says Plato went wrong, and it's all his fault.
I agree with you, but my gloss is he is piggybacking on the expectation of an anti-Platonism in his audience, and unjustly, because he knows better, right? He's expecting that lots of people in his time and place and day will be open to a sweeping dismissal of lots of history of Western philosophy that resulted in things that he doesn't like and they don't like as Platonism, because they're used to that charge. They were schooled on it by Nietzsche, and they are inclined to believe it and agree with it. And if he tried to reverse that, he'd be running into a headwind. So he doesn't. And when he goes to the actual text itself, he'll be fair to Plato. And when he goes to the actual text, he'll be fair to Heraclitus, right? But that's not the same thing as saying, here are all the things I learned from Heraclitus, here are all the things I learned from Plato, and that you should too, and that, by the way, Nietzsche forgot. He's not going to set up fights between important contemporaries around him that have tons of cachet and dismissed ancients that he can barely get people to read, right? That's part of my read of it. He's willing to go along with presenting the sweeping grand narrative, because the sweeping grand narrative has its uses and it has its allies, right? But if you look at the level of the individual bricks, he knows it's an unjust charge, so he knows better. And I think that if he knows better, he shouldn't do it. He shouldn't be that dismissive of it. That's my own take, right? But in terms of correspondence theory of truth, by the way, there's a little bit of that already in Heraclitus in ways that Heidegger loves. We're about to get to the fragment. I realize we might leave some of this for next time, but part of the fragment is, listening not to me but to the logos, wise as agreement, one all, right? The agreement is same saying, and the same saying is that those who hearken to the logos, same say with the logos, right? I put it to you, that's agreement by another name, but it's agreement as what logos itself calls for. The appropriation of the thinker by being is experienced by Heraclitus as an agreement theory of truth. The thing you have to agree with, though, is the logos, or or the call of being or something, not the statement and the reality. It's not putting it in the statement like an Aristotle will later. But there is already a sense of this agreement correspondence thing, even in Heraclitus, but in accents that are entirely Heideggerian.
Right, and I mean, so Heidegger is not against the correspondence theory. I mean, when Heidegger's doing algebra, he's using the correspondence theory. Heidegger's saying that there's other senses of truth.
I know, but this is that other sense of truth, and here Heraclitus is experiencing that other sense of truth as also a matter of correspondence. It's a matter of being in accord with and hearkening to what the logos says, what the logos demands, right? There's an element of trimming yourself to the logos, not the other way around, that Heraclitus is appealing to as the way that truth speaks, right? Entirely Heideggerian notion of truth. It's not the narrow correspondence theory. It's not only applying in algebra, right? He's talking about a poetic sense of hearkening to the logos, right? All the things that Heidegger likes, but it's still a seed from which correspondence can grow. So if this is not something blameworthy in Heraclitus, that he has that seed of correspondence, why is the tiny seed of correspondence in the Theaetetus any worse, right? So there's an uncharitability of standards. Is my fundamental diagnosis. But I want to go on another example of this where I think that it's even more, if I can put it this way, more cutting. And he may have a stronger case, but it's still a more cutting example. When we're talking about the notion of the unlimited being thought of as almost like a concept, or when we're talking about Plato with the idea that there has to be an idea for idea of things if they're finite, because they have to have an essence. We're talking about the appeal to the notion of the common, the koinon in Theaetetus. All of these are ways in which these metaphysical thinkers, and they were metaphysical thinkers, appealed to something like logical uniformity in arriving at things which were truths about being. And that's exactly what he dislikes about the dividing out the least common denominator version of understanding metaphysics in Aristotle. But these other people before it are doing it too. And all of them are willing to get guidance from grammar, from what's common, from generality, right, from the common, in order to arrive at things which are truths of reason rather than truths of experience. They're not against it. It's not a method which is tainted to them. They're as open to that method as any other, to any intuitive method, right? And if there's a person who has a problem with that method, it's Heidegger. He thinks that that's heading you down a slippery slope to logical positivism and constructivism and nominalism, where everything is going to only be what we make it, and therefore it's going to become a human construct, and any truth independent of the human mind is going to be lost contact with, right? He fears it for that reason. But all of these metaphysical thinkers are perfectly willing to go there, and they don't see any danger in it whatsoever. They trust it. So are they right, or is he right? If you're just talking about consequences that could result from it, maybe he's right. But if you're talking about the way it fit into their actual thought, which didn't go to those other places, they were right. It didn't have those consequences for them. They didn't become dismissive logical positivists and constructionists just because they appealed to the koinon as a sense of what being is, right? All right, Dan.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that, like, Heidegger chooses to, I don't know, to engage with different authors and, I don't know, a course or a book. And I always find he's always extremely generous and sympathetic when he's doing that. I love that, you know, like, helps you to understand. And he takes, like, even if he engages not just with pre-Socratics, but with Plato or Aristotle, or later with Descartes or Kant and Hegel. But then when he constructs his theory, then he's kind of like taking all of them down, like when he puts everything together. And I agree with you that that's pretty much what he's doing. But on the other hand, he is very sympathetic when he engages with them one to one, and that's an amazing thing.
I agree with you. It's one of the things I really like about him. It's why I find him, you know, compelling to read on each of these other thinkers that he handled, you know, in a long history of professorship, right, where he treated them all fairly, right? Yeah, entire agreement on that. We're only 2 hours in. We haven't gotten to the Heraclitus fragment, but several people expressed the desire to slow down and do these things one in a session rather than two in a session. So I want to know whether or not you guys want to continue and try to do details of the Heraclitus fragment, or if we should just take questions on the Anaximander fragment and come back to the Heraclitus fragment in a next session. Does people have preferences around the table on that? Which way? I know, Joe, you haven't read the Heraclitus fragment section yet, so you might want to do it next time. I think the same is true of Jim. But are there other votes on that?
Yeah, it's a fair assessment, but I don't want to stop you guys because of my.
Yeah, you're not stopping us. We're gonna get everyone's opinion, but
yeah, so I'm leaning more towards let's give the Heraclitus a full session.
yeah, that works for me.
I agree with that.
Okay. I think we're out of quorum, but Craig, do you have a thought on that? You're good? All right. Then, you know, without objection, so to speak, it is so ordered, right? We will have our next section be devoted just to the Heraclitus Logos fragment, and then we'll slow down to a fragment each and give this some of the attention it deserves. I do want to give people a chance to ask any questions they have about the details of the Anaximander fragment. I know several people mentioned places where they had problems with the language. If there's details like that anyone wants to get into, hit me, as they say.
There is one question I have on the choice of the readings. Is there a reason why he put the Parmenides in between the two Heraclitus? Is there a method behind his madness of the order?
Possibly. I can't say that I fully discern the method to it, but there's definitely a bookend aspect of the Heraclitus thing, because the second Heraclitus thing is all about this notion of what likes to hide, and how can they hide from what never sets is a fragment, right? And that's related to being, related to truth, related to physis or emerging presence in Heraclitus himself, but it's also where Heidegger's own thesis that there's something about being disappearing behind beings is at stake, right? At stake in two ways. Is it something which is true of the phenomena and already seen by Heraclitus, or something which is true of the phenomena and missed by all of these thinkers? Those are two different possible outcomes there. And I think that it's not missed by Heraclitus. So I think that that's the reason that comes last. It's in a way it's the Aletheia fragment, but it's the so he's getting at this, what was the early Greek sense of Aletheia, and he's headed towards, they got this point about being disappearing behind beings. They didn't miss it, right? As for why the Moira fragment is in the middle, this is the statement that thinking and being are the same, which is like the most famous thing in Parmenides. So we're going through the logos stuff to thinking and being is the same, to how do we understand that which the never sets which likes to hide, something like that. So is that an ascent? I think from Heidegger's point of view, it kind of is an ascent, but it's an ascent towards how far he thinks each of these people saw towards things that he sees in his own philosophy, if that makes sense. So I think that's the ordering principle of them. It's not that, yeah, I think that's the ordering principle of them. Good question though. Dan?
Yeah, I remember something I want to mention, and you also mentioned some, like, there is another book, I think he taught a course on Parmenides and Anaximander
Yes.
a few years after he published Being in Time, and there, now I remember he makes a big deal about time at the ending, like you mentioned, you said that this fragment ends with time, and the time is kind of the background. And I remember now that in that course, he takes time and he makes a big deal of it, while here he's no longer even mention it, or pretty much ignores it.
Yeah, here he's not even sure that it's part of the original of Anaximander's own voice.
Exactly.
But in the Parmenides book, the thing which was the biggest disappointment to me is that he never really gets to the actual three ways parts of Parmenides, which I would think is the thing the thing that I wish that I found him commenting on in that book, right, was Parmenides lays out the famous three ways: the way of being, the way of opinion in which there is no strong or reliant truth, and the way of the altogether not. And if there's an ancient pre-Socratic text that was made to be commented on by Heidegger, right, it's that. And it's exactly the right place to talk about it in the Parmenides lectures. And he spends all his time on the preamble to the Goddess of Truth intro to the poem, and then goes off into meaning of the word truth and chasing illusions in Plato and other places. And he never gets back to the Parmenidean, the substance of the Parmenidean poem, where it gets most philosophical. I do appreciate this one because this particular saying is the being and thinking of one. I mean, being and thinking being the same is another deep text of Parmenides, but the place where I most miss Heidegger giving his commentary on a pre-Socratic is that nowhere in his works on Parmenides do I find him commenting on the three ways in detail.
I think he does a bit in Introduction to Metaphysics.
But
there's a part
only quickly.
Yeah,
right.
it's like over in a couple pages, but it's.
I think you're right.
Part of his saying that Parmenides and Heraclitus are saying the same thing contra the tradition.
Yes.
I think he uses that
Okay.
part of Parmenides.
I'll go look.
It's a couple pages and it's over, I think.
Yeah, I'll go back and look at it. But I think that passage in Parmenides is reserving a far deeper commentary, and But I will go back and look at that, see how far he gets into it. But the things which Parmenides says there about the way of mortals are really quite insightful. Anyway, I don't know if people know this stuff from pre-Socratics, but if there was an extra fragment in here, I would want that. I would want the three ways. Okay, but so questions on the language or anything else from the first section. What about the sections where he's introing his own views of these things and his understanding of the epoche of being and so on? That I assume that those are the kinds of things that Pete has seen before, Dan has seen before, and it flew right over everybody else's head. I'm exaggerating for clarity. This is on page 26 and 27. After saying several times, like a catechism, that as it reveals itself in being withdrawals. This is the very bottom of the page. We may call this luminous keeping to itself of the truth of its essence, the epoche of being. However, this word, borrowed from Stoic philosophers, does not here have the Husserlian sense, objectification or methodological exclusion by an act of thetic consciousness. The epoche of being belongs to being itself. We are here thinking of it in terms of the experience of the oblivion of being. From the epoche of being comes the epochal essence of its destiny, in which world history properly consists. So there is all of the sounding mystical you could want, Joe. When being keeps to itself and its destiny, world suddenly and unexpectedly comes to pass. Every epoch in world history is an efficacy of errancy. This is all the stuff of his own mature philosophy on this, and it's being laid out here. How to put it? This is an intro section where he just lays out his own scheme for thinking about these things as though it's just fact for you to accept, and it's meant to just help you think about it, to see how he thinks about it. But he's not giving you any argument of why this is the case. He's just assuming that I can tell you this is the way to think about it, and then you'll put everything I'm about to say afterwards into the appropriate boxes that this view of the whole of philosophical history describes. But if you want a terse description of what that whole view is, the early parts of this essay are up there in terms of how much he gets across, how quickly and clearly, if that's the right word. I don't know how clear it is for you guys though, so you have to tell me. Did people just miss that, not pay any attention? Pete doesn't want to offer anything because he already has his own thoughts on it, right? He already knows.
Well, so I mean, the epical stuff is that if we're going to understand Aristotle's metaphysics, that things are timeless, but Heidegger's saying that back in Heraclitus's time, there was a different understanding of being that guided what was possible in his time.
Yes, but let's be clear. He doesn't just say a different understanding of being, right? It was a different epoch in the truth of being.
Right.
Because truth of being modifies being by being what is revealed about it, what is uncovered about it, what is unconcealed about it.
And so that was their in their age, the primary way of beings to appear were to appear in front of you, to presence in front of you, which is different from other epochs.
I think it's not just that. I think it's not just the sense of enduring presence. It's also this whole understanding of being in the beings and the same, and there's a whole tissue of metaphysics that's part of that epoch. I don't think it's because if you just go with the enduring presence definition, the epoch is too long, and it describes too much of the history. The reality is, as those other things move around, you're in a different epoch.
Right, and so the permanent presence is actually, metaphysics after Aristotle. In Heraclitus' time, presence is Fus is whooshing up
Sure.
at you.
Sure. Sure.
Um,
But there's more than just those two in the epochs of metaphysics, or the epochs of being, rather, not even metaphysics, right? Each of the major shifts that he's describing in the Nietzsche lecture, for example, in the Western metaphysical history, is a different epoch of being because of the truth of being, because it's different. It's not just that people had a different understanding or different opinions about being. It's not always thinking about it. This is the thing which is characteristically of this section and characteristic of Heidegger's understanding of this. This is not something which was just shifting opinions about an unchanging problem.
No, it's being itself. So it's how
Yes.
you understand reality. And yeah, so 300 years after this, in John 1:1,
Mhm.
there's a completely different understanding of the
Of logo.
logos,
Yes.
which is the word of God.
It's
Which
not a
is not-
completely different, but it's a different.
It's a different understanding of being in Heidegger's terms.
Yes. Yes. Yes, absolutely. But it's not just a different. I'm trying to get at this point that for him, this is not just changing understandings or changing opinions about. It is. He's deliberately reversing the usual agency sign in the relation. It's not different people doing different things.
Mhm.
It's being revealing something different about itself to various thinkers, right? The epochs of being are the times when different footprints of being are or are not revealed to the thinkers of that time.
Right, and it's not all of Plato's fault or
Sure.
Luke's fault in John. Well, I'm assuming Luke wrote John. Heidegger's point is that they're not willfully creating a reality.
Yes.
That being that they're already
Yes.
living in their epoch.
Yes. Yes.
And they just articulated it in a new way for others.
Yes, but understand why that change in sign of the agency relation is so critical to Heidegger, right? Because a Nietzschean would understand the same phenomena, right, as a changing opinion from a changing culture, from a changing value, from a changing projected need, with all the accent on the driving and the need and the human and the human needs being the originating cause. And that understanding of what it is for opinion to change and culture to change as people change their mind voluntarily, something like that, puts all of the agency in willful human cultural opinion, regardless of what drives it, including it being driven from below by the lower impulses, something like that. And that's exactly what this reversal of language is meant to foreclose. He's trying to foreclose the idea that this is something which can just be interpreted as a shifting set of human opinions in response to a shifting configuration of human needs, longings, and power requirements, or something like that in a Nietzschean frame. Right?
Yeah, and so I mean, you could say that that's one way of putting Heidegger's insight, that we're thrown into being. We don't create our world.
Yes, and this is again where he's making that language reversal deliberately to distinguish his thought, which is as historical as Nietzschean thought, from Nietzsche's thought, which is not just historical but human constructive historical. Right? Sorry, question from Guy. Gui, I just can't. I'm sorry. I see the things. Gui, is that right? Guy. Okay. I always get the G wrong. Guy. Okay. I'm focused on the U and I, and so I get the G wrong every time. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I'm really trying to appreciate what's at stake here, and I'm struggling with it.
Okay.
But let me see if I'm close to the path or something. So what you're saying is that I think what you're calling the epoch of that Nietzsche was part of it's centered around the subjectivity of the human or the social experience.
Yes.
So that part I get, and that fits into my understanding. The other part, and this really interests me, is Heidegger saying that being in this different epoch amounts to having agency, and being is communicating to members of that age. It's communicating to them directly. So it's not human subjectivity that's the need. It's actually being directing. I don't know, the progress, the evolution, the dynamics. It's directing rather than human understanding directing. Is that close to what's being discussed?
Yes, with the nuance that there is still a need for the thinkers who are attending to and responsive to what is happening to being. But yes, you've got the basic story right. And this is one of the things we saw in the last essay, on the Word of Nietzsche essay, where the punchline of the Word of Nietzsche essay is, what is happening to being in the era of Nietzschean metaphysics? And the answer is, nothing is happening to being. Being has stopped communicating to man because man has stopped listening.
Okay, so
because man has decided that he lives in a world entirely of his artificial construction, and therefore no one is listening no one is hearkening to the logos instead of to the speaker, as Heraclitus is telling us here in our next fragment. And because no one is listening to logos, the appearing truth of being is silent. Objective truth is not even being sought. People thinking that they're living only in their construction only worry about constructions and whose construction. And so objective truth has disappeared. And so has any concern for it. That's the diagnosis of what happens with the Nietzschean end of metaphysics, where metaphysics reaches its subjectivist culmination, something like that. And Heidegger is reacting to that by trying to reverse that subjectivism, in the sense that, yes, a thinking subject that is responding to what objective truth can tell him is still important, but his understanding of that is man is the shepherd of being. Man is the person who can be called by being to listen to it. But the activity there is a listening, not a constructing, and it's all the difference between discovering something versus making it. Does that make sense?
Now I have that experience myself. I feel like I'm communicated with in that way, and it's like I know it doesn't come from me because I'm not that smart, but yes. it comes through, and it's all extremely intelligible. And yes. I don't understand the process itself, and that's part of my own. What I'm struggling with personally is I'm not even sure how to articulate it, but it's like I have experiences that I can't account for, and I don't want to go supernatural, but and I don't want to make anything up, but I don't understand what the underlying dynamic is, and that's what I'd really like to understand is what is going on, how to understand that communication.
Yeah, fair, and so would Heidegger. He will say things like language is the house of being. It's thinking is a poetic activity. There are elements of intellectual intuition in it. In this passage and the next, he appeals to the sense of lightning, sudden illumination that he finds in Heraclitus. He also points to the reorientation, the turning around in Plato's allegory of the cave. He talks about the experience of wonder in another one of his books on basic problems. Was it? Wonder as the origin of this. He talks about releasement, the sense of the mind turning over its concerns and to what is laying claim to it as a releasement or letting go of the hyper-rationalist sense of control, something like that. So he has many ways of talking about this in different places. There's no question that he thinks of it as it's a peak experience kind of thing that thinkers as such, those who are called to do thinking, experience. And on this regard, he would agree with Nietzsche that thoughts that come on doves' seek guide the world. He thinks that this is what steers history in the large, not the other way around. So yeah, you're on the right track as to the things that he cares about.
So I have the experience. I can access the experience. I don't proclaim to understand it, but I can access the experience. Now, one of the things I'm curious about in this discussion at this point, or at earlier points, is when you're bringing in the logos and then you're bringing in the biblical references. Is this supernatural? Is this a supernatural point of view? Is it a religious point of view, or is it strictly a philosophical point of view? And
well,
essential. Go ahead.
Okay, the theologians differ, right? I mean, for Heidegger, it's primarily a philosophical and thinking point of view, but there are plenty of ways in which these traditions cross, and there are plenty of people in the religious traditions will tell you that what they're talking about is the same thing that philosophers are talking about. Not all of them. Some of them will reject that vehemently, but the point is there is no you should not look for uniformity as an answer to this question, right? You should look for variety as an answer to this question.
Okay, so can I understand this then? So a person can have the experience, and then they construct a context or a framework to understand or explain that experience. And then they might explain it as the word of God. They might explain it in different contexts just to ground it to them. And yes.
Here's the problem with that understanding, right? If they're just constructing it, you're back in a Nietzschean world.
Right.
So they're differing as to what it actually is. They're interpreting it differently, certainly, but that difference is not something that they all acknowledge. They're simply constructing as opposed to learning, discovering. If they all agreed that they were constructing it, they would regard it as just a value, and this is just a biological function of a higher organism, and they would all be Nietzscheans.
Okay, so I got that. So what does Heidegger say about this, and how does Heidegger give this context?
Heidegger talks about this entirely in the realm of, well, not entirely. He talks about this as a kind of ethic or piety of thought, but in almost all philosophical contexts. He does occasionally make religious allusions to it. You can read some of his things where you put God in the place of being, but he's not willing to go there. He will talk about the waiting for the last God in some of his later works, but waiting because not there yet, something like that. But people have certainly detected many elements of the sort of ethics of thinking that you find in Heidegger that echo elements of earlier mystical religious traditions, right? It seems to be influenced by people like Meister Eckhart, by some of the German quietists of the late Reformation, those sorts of things. He was schooled in, Thomas Aquinas and all that sort of stuff, as well as Aristotle, in his own background. So I mean, all those things are there, but he himself is not willing to take this to a religious place. He takes it to a thinking place. I don't know if that helps you, but that's where he is himself on it.
So it seems like the conclusion that I'm getting out of that is that the proper context for one that has this experience would be then extreme humility.
Yes, but it's a humility that sometimes goes hand in hand with making statements like this sort of revelatory experience is that in which world history properly consists, which is humility of a different order than the kind you find down at the mall. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm not looking at mall humility. I'm not looking at it that way.
I know. I'm just saying that. Yes, there's an inner sense of humility in the interpretation of the experience, but there's also a grandiosity that comes from the felt depth of the experience, and those are both parts of it.
Yeah,
I think
it's humility and awe at the same time.
Yes, I think awe is even the predecessor of the humility. I mean, awe is the subject of. Sorry, give me a second. I'll show you the book so you can know what I'm talking about. This is Heidegger on awe and wonder as the origin of philosophy, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So these are great questions. I also encourage, if you're interested, we've got lots of back stuff on Heidegger and others on the YouTube channel that goes along with these meetups, because we've got like 3 years of our past meetups on my YouTube channel. I post the link to the discussion at the end of each session. So I invite you to go explore them if you're interested. Craig, you got a question or thought?
Two comments that are kind of out in left field, but one leads to a question. The other area, if you go outside of philosophy into dealing with the awe and wonder, the classic on that is Rudolf Otto, The Idea of the Holy. That is the best exposition of aspects of that, and the one that I found most helpful in my own sorting out. The other question that
May I ask, can I
What?
make a request? Could you put a post somewhere below this of the work you were pointing to?
Okay, yeah, I'll find
Yeah.
it and post it.
I think there might be multiple people interested, so it'd be great if you can post that afterwards.
Yeah, I'll probably
Thanks.
put it at the same place that Pete put it in the actual discussion, the actual
Sounds good.
comments. That's a little bit more
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect.
stable. The other question is any overlap between Heidegger and a contemporary of his at Heidelberg, Karl Jaspers, and the whole discussion on the axial age, which is granted much more multidisciplinary and much more global than just Greek. And is this uniquely a Greek phenomena, or is it a uniquely Greek phenomena because that's how philosophy developed? That's kind of one that's been kicked around behind the back of my mind. That Pete may have more to say on that as much as you, but I found it interesting to look at Jaspers taking a broader perspective of something that happened in this age, in the axial age, which is an Aximander right in the middle of that. So I'm just curious if I haven't found any overlap between the two of them though. In writings.
So you don't find Heidegger talking about the actual age. You do find some of Heidegger's students interested in those sorts of questions. Jonas is an example of that. But Heidegger himself, in his own time and writings, tended to be quite dismissive of Jaspers, sometimes unfairly so. He tended to regard Jaspers as a popularizer of stuff going on in sort of deeper work of like his own, that he thought often mangled it in popularizing it, and was he tended to try to distance himself from Jaspers and Jaspers' reputation. He didn't think Jaspers was as highbrow as he was, or something like that. And there may be an element of simple academic competitiveness in that, but he was not kindly disposed towards Jaspers. I don't think that was reciprocated. I think Jaspers was quite admiring of Heidegger and learned a lot from him, and was perfectly decent to him back. But Heidegger was not very kind to Jaspers in his public comments about him, and he often has acid asides about this is the popular version of understanding stuff and being in time, and it's way too shallow to take seriously or something, right? So not necessarily his best take on anything, let's put it that way. But that's what you tend to get from him on Jaspers. It's this kind of he's above him dismissiveness.
Okay, but it sounds like a good direction to look would be Hans Jonas.
Jonas is good. Yeah, I agree. So his students, and then I think Jaspers himself is fine. Is fine on the point. I don't have the same negative opinion of Jaspers that Heidegger has of him. I think his negative opinion was a bit unjust. But there's another earlier existentialist who's also, I don't think he particularly talks about the actual age, but I find useful, which is the Schuler, which is more of the Christian side of existentialism at the same time. But and then there's Rosenzweig, even earlier. But so I think all of those people are worth reading, and I don't think that Heidegger's take on Jaspers was just, but it was definitely not very positive. Dan?
Yeah, going back to Jasper, there is that like at some point I remember Jasper writes to Heidegger and tells him that his understanding of truth as aletheia doesn't make any sense to him. Like he says that thing is
Doesn't get
doesn't
it.
make sense. Yeah, doesn't get it. And then when Jasper like writes that denazification letter, a recommendation, he said that he writes something like Heidegger's philosophy is just mystical nonsense, and he should be banned from teaching because there is no value in it.
Okay. So at that point, there's a completely open break in both directions. I take it. Yeah, fair. But it's interesting to say that I don't get the aletheia on truth. That's a strange thing to miss. I wouldn't expect an ability like that on Jasper's part. I don't think that's the kind of, it's not that hard a concept that you have to kind of willfully not want to get it to not get it. But useful anecdote. All right, so thanks for that. Other thoughts on the Anaximander fragment, or are we good to go on to the question of scheduling the next? So if everybody has the book, I wouldn't mind trying to do this. Well, we can certainly do it in 4 weeks. That would be the 12th of February. Does anyone want earlier than that, or does 12th of February work for people? 12th works.
I'm indifferent, so I'm not going anyplace. And if we wanted to, I have the book, and so I'm not concerned about that.
Yep, I just have another event near the 5th, so it would be easier for me to do the 12th. So that's the reason I'm thinking of it. That's 4 weeks from today. And
February 12th, okay.
I'm good with the 12th.
that sounds great. Jim, do you
Yep,
think you'll be able to make the 12th?
Yep, that's fine.
All right, so let's plan on the Heraclitus fragment on the 12th. That is the Logos fragment. I have to tell you, this is my my favorite fragment of Heraclitus. One of my favorite fragments in the Pre-Socratics. I think there's an enormous amount in it, and I think Heidegger brings out an enormous amount in it. I don't think it's quite all of it, but that's only because I've studied for too long. And who knows if he brings out some things that aren't there, and I probably do too. But love to hear you guys take on it. I think it's a wonderful wonderful little snippet, and to me it shows this. It's maybe one of the clearer things that you get from Heraclitus, honestly, but it still has lots of multiple meanings. Doesn't have just one reading, doesn't have just one interpretation, right? There's and it's not even necessarily that it has multiple meanings, it's that there's multiple allusions going on in it, if you get me, right? Ways in which the accent is on the accent being on different concepts in the same phrase gives it a slightly different meaning, and all those meanings are meant. I particularly want you to pay attention to what happens with wise. I mentioned this a little bit in terms of how he translates wise, but what happens with wise? Wise and same, those are both two things to pay attention to. Everyone pays attention to logos, everyone pays attention to hen panta. I want you to notice that it is hen panta without a verb. It's not, it's not all is one. People often interpret translate the last part as all is one, but it's not one, all is one. There's no is, and it's not that order. It's one all, right? It can be helpful in this to just look at every Greek word, translate that Greek word, and read it. You know it's going to be out of order in English, doesn't matter. Read it in the Greek order. Whatever else you do, try reading it in the Greek order where you hear each Greek word sounding. You can hear it in the translation, but hear each Greek word sounding in the order that he writes them. The other thing to pay particular attention to in the words themselves is there's a word that is translated agreement or something like it, and the word is homologon. Right? It's same saying or same logos, because logos may mean saying and it might mean something else. But whatever logos means, agreement is same in front of it. It's same saying or something like that. Okay, and that's just if you look at the fragment, this first word of the second line, that O M O. that little thing's upside down U as an M, right? And there's a silent H at the front of it. That's the homo of same, and then logan, O-L-O-G-E-I-N. That's the homologan of same saying. So it's the same logos on the line above. All right. We'll hear more about same in the Parmenides one next, because same is also a term of art, not just a equal sign. All right. Anyway, that's just a little bit of foreshadowing what we might get in the Heraclitus fragment. All right, so I think we're good for this session. I'll put the recording up on YouTube later and put a link in below the below this meetup. When that's done, I should get the invite for the next one out. It'll probably be a day or two before I get that out. I'll see if I can follow up on this issue of people making sure people get announcements, but see if I have any settings wrong in YouTube or something. Not YouTube, sorry, YouTube in meetup. All right, that's all I got there. Any other final questions or comments? All right, then I'll stop the recording and see you guys next time.
I want to say thank you, Jason. It was a great meeting. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Please come back.
I'll be back. I liked it.
Wonderful.